Materials processing class. Mr. Voigt here. This is the motorized miter saw is the technical name for this. We also just call it the miter saw, or sometimes even the chop saw. This is the next piece of equipment we're going to be covering. So I'm going to very quickly go over the different parts of this, and then the safety, the ways to safely cut something on here. Obviously this is our handle. It has a trigger on it. You can squeeze and let go. That's really important because sometimes you want to let go quickly. Don't let go of the whole saw, but just the trigger. You almost never want to just let go of the saw. In fact, I don't know of a situation where you would want to do that. But anyway, so this saw will come down. It will also slide out. As to cut safely, if you have a piece of wood that is not very wide, all you have to do is start the saw. You never ever want to be touching your lumber when you cut. You want to start it and then plunge it down through, and you want to hold it. This is our fence, this is our table, and this is the part of the saw. It's called the turn base, or the part of the table that rotates, and you rotate it to different angles, and they're labeled. They're labeled down here. It's called the miter scale because you're going to put a miter on this. So you're going to cut the board at a miter because you turn this base, okay, the table base, to a certain degrees, and you cross cut at a miter. So remember, miters are where you cut all the way through this board, cross cut at an angle. So that's why it's called a miter saw, because it gets used to do miter cuts, cross cut miter cuts. That's what it's really good at. So this is our turn base. Obviously this whole thing is called the table. This is our miter scale. This particular saw can also tilt by loosening a little lever back there, can tilt this direction. And that will cut something like this, which is a bevel, or at this end a chamfer. And if you watched my types of cuts video, I go over those. But anyway, this side is the bevel, where you cut all the way through in a cross cut at an angle. Okay? This particular cut, if you can't see it very well, but it goes at a miter. So from here it's a miter, and this way it's also at an angle. It's not at 90 degrees to the face, so it's also a bevel. We call those compound miters. So this saw can cut any kind of cross cut, so those would be miter cuts, and it can also cut bevel cuts. So when you add those two things together, you get a compound miter. So anyway, this is this whole thing here where the saw is on is called the arm. There's a scale back here, again labeled in degrees. That is our bevel scale. So this is our miter scale in degrees, bevel scale in degrees. This is just called the slide, the part that lets it slide out. This is our permanent or our stationary blade guard, and this is our retractable blade guard, and that comes up as you push it down. It automatically comes up. Okay, so there are some adjustments on this saw that I'm not going to go over in this video. You can do a depth adjustment to this saw so that it only cuts so deep, and so it doesn't cut all the way through your material. Those are over here. It does lock down in the down position. On the test, this is the safest way to leave the saw when you're not using it, and that will be the right answer on the test. We don't leave it like that. I've explained to you guys in class that all these tests questions are safest practice. We try to follow as many of those safest practices as we possibly can. Some of them are a bit too cumbersome for us to do every time. I will, if I leave this for long periods of time, I will sometimes lock it down and leave it here, just so nobody comes in and dinks with it. But you guys should be trained when you're in here to understand that it doesn't need to be locked like this all the time. We also have a lever here that you have to sometimes pull up and then squeeze so you can move and do your miter adjustments. And then it's best, because in the middle here, it doesn't lock into place. There's 5 or 6 places that are common angles, common miters that people cut, that it'll lock. So if I move it, see here it lock into place, and then it doesn't really move. But it's better if I push this down until it clicks, and then it really locks it in place. So angles. Okay, angles like 5 degrees. You have 22.5, which is half of 45, and so forth. So you have these different angle spots that get used a lot in woodworking and construction that have those notches. Obviously, this is our fence. I've already mentioned that, but the fence is important because when you cut on here, you want to push that lumber right in there and you want to hold it tight. Like always, you want to keep your fingers 6 inches away from the blade whenever possible. If you need to hold it closer than that, you need to get something else to hold the wood, to get closer. So a lot of times I'll put another piece of wood on the top and it holds it down closer to the blade than I want to get my fingers. So I get auxiliary things to help me hold that lumber down. After you cut with this saw, the best way to hold this, I will make a cut. So because my board here isn't very wide, I don't have to come out like this. I can just plunge. You see how I held the blade down and let go of the trigger as my blade stopped turning, and then bring it up. That is the safest way to run the saw, always. But especially if you're trapped between a stop out here in the blade, that is absolutely essential that you do it that way. So you pull down, let go, let it stop spinning, and stop. And I mentioned earlier, you always want to go, you do not want to plunge and then pull out to get the end of it. You always want to come out, plunge down, and then push through the board. That's because I want to be pushing into my fence when I'm cutting, because that'll hold it really well stationary and true. If I'm pulling it through my lumber this way, I got to hold that board like that, and that can be difficult. Okay? If this thing ever starts, if you listen to when you're cutting, you'll get used to using this. If you start feeling it not cut very well, or you hear the motor really whine, you know it's having a hard time cutting through. And when it does that, it's going to kick back at some point. So you need to be aware of that. If it ever starts, it kicks on you, you need to try to, instead of doing something else, just let go of the trigger so it stops running. But you don't let go of the whole saw. You try to hold everything in place, but you should start kind of being aware of the sounds of this saw if you start using it more, because you can kind of predict when the kickback is going to happen. It sounds different and it feels different. But if it kicks back, the answer on the test is going to be hold it down and let go of the trigger. Do not let go of the whole saw, and it'll stop instantly. Okay? So that's how you should handle things that kick back. Just let go of it. Do not let go of everything else. Often you'll make a mark on this board, and again, I go over this in class with you, so it shouldn't be brand new, but when I make a mark, if I put my blade right on my mark, that blade takes out 1/8 of an inch. And so I don't want to line my blade up right on it, because then the piece I'm going to use might be just a little bit shorter than I want it to be. I'm going to line my blade up on the side of the mark that I'm not going to be using, that isn't part of the piece that I laid out. So we call that putting the blade on the waist side of the line. Don't forget to do that when you line up. So if you're not using a stop to make multiple cuts that are the same length, remember that stop makes it both faster. I don't have to lay out each line. I can just slide it down and touch my stop and cut. Makes it faster, and it makes it more accurate because I have something there and I can make everything the exact same length. If I pull a tape on it and make a mark and then line up on my waist side, I'm going to have a little air in that every time. So when you use a stop, it's because it's both more accurate and quicker. I'm just looking here. So GFCI, I have this plugged into a regular outlet because we're indoors. It's not going to have any water. You'll have a question on there that if you use these outdoors, which a lot of contractors do, to be safest, you should have it plugged into what we call a GFCI outlet. Those are those outlets with the little buttons on them that you have in a bathroom or near a kitchen. In a house, that if you're near water, they're code to have. Anyway, if you're outdoors, they say you should, to be safest, have these plugged into a GFCI. In case there's damp ground or damp conditions, you are more protected. Those outlets protect you from shock better than a regular breaker in a breaker box. So that'll be an answer on the test. There'll be a question about warped lumber. I may take this out of the test, so if it's not on there, but if it says anything about warped lumber, it's safest to cut it if you clamp it to the table. Now, I really don't want you cutting warped lumber on here without us looking at it first. There are ways. Warped lumber is warped lumber that isn't completely flat, and it doesn't sit flat. So you can have problems with, as you cut, that lumber pinching the blade and making it hard, binding the blade up and making it more likely that it's going to kick back. And that can be a real problem. So if we have lumber that's not real flat, we might want to get together. And so I may not leave that question on the test. I don't want you to think that it's safe to cut anything that's warped. On the test, if it's still on there, the answer will be to clamp it to the table, okay, to help you keep from having this kick back. But I might just say don't cut things that you think have any kind of warp on them unless we can. There's ways to do it to make it safer, and I would have to help you with that. Okay, so the only other thing, if you make a trial cut, if I make a mark on here or on any border, what I would do is anytime I come over here, because this gets moved around and you need to make sure you have the right setup. You got to make sure you're at 0. If you want to have a square 90-degree cross cut, you got to make sure your bevel and your miter at 0, and this is all adjusted true, right? That it's adjusted correctly. So you probably want to make a trial cut on a piece of scrap or on an end of a board you're not going to use to make sure that it all is set up correctly. And then even if you have it set up, with an angle or a bevel, you might want to make a trial cut on something just to make sure that before you cut your long piece of expensive lumber that it's cutting right and that it's set up right. That'll be on the test too. That it's cutting okay and that it's set up okay and it's set up correctly. So make a trial cut on things a lot of times. If it's a piece of wood that you could replicate if you make a mistake or whatever, then you aren't going to do that every time, but it is a good practice to make trial cuts, especially on cuts to things that are going to be hard to replicate and you don't want to mess up very badly. Okay. The only other thing I'm going to talk about is PPEs on this saw. Make sure that you're not wearing long things. I've covered that. The PPE stuff is the same on this. The musts and the shoulds that you have to wear, it's the same on this saw as any other saw. All right. This saw that we have here is really good because I have a really long table. We can have long material on it. This can cut up to 11.5 inches, I believe, in width, which is pretty wide. That cuts anything that you can buy from the lumber yard that is what we call dimensioned lumber. There are some pieces that might be a little wider, and then we would have to cut them another way if we wanted to get all the way through them. So again, you're going to put a piece of board in there. You're going to keep that all the way down. And again, I'm going to stand to one side or the other. Keep my hand at least 6 inches away. Out, down, and in. Okay, that's the miter saw.